"Why don't you try something lighter, Grandpa? We don't want you throwing your back out." The clerk smirked, but Calvin Mercer didn't flinch. No anger, no protest, just quiet dignity. "I understand," he said, turning, his walking stick tapping the floor, carrying the weight of wars and their mockery. Then 12 men stepped through that door. No words, no shouting, just silence, the kind that makes your chest tight. They weren't there for guns. They were there for honor, for a brother, for a debt that could never be repaid. When a storm mocked an old warrior, these Navy SEALs taught them what respect looks like. Stay with us. This is a story of loyalty, sacrifice, and a lesson no one forgot. Calvin Mercer was not a man who sought attention. He never did. From the first day he raised his hand and took the oath to serve, Calvin believed in action over words, loyalty over recognition, and sacrifice without expectation of reward. Born into a working-class family in rural Kentucky, Calvin knew struggle early. His father was a factory worker. His mother cleaned houses. Honor wasn't something they spoke about. It was simply how they lived. That same quiet sense of duty would carry Calvin through 3 wars, countless battles, and decades of service that left deep marks on both his body and his soul. Calvin wasn't just a soldier. He was a decorated officer in the Special Operations community, a man who had led missions in Vietnam's dense jungles, navigated the harsh deserts of the Middle East, and moved silently through war-torn cities where danger lurked behind every corner. He earned 2 bronze stars, a silver star he never mentioned, and 3 purple hearts that spoke of wounds that had healed on the outside, but left scars within. His brothers in arms spoke of him in hushed tones with a respect that went beyond rank. Calvin was the man who would carry you out if you fell, no matter the cost to himself. He was the one who stayed calm when chaos erupted, who saw the mission through even when the odds were impossible. But wars end, missions conclude, and soldiers come home. What no one prepares these warriors for is what comes next, the silence. The kind of silence that fills the spaces where once there had been camaraderie, purpose, and meaning. Calvin Mercer, the man who had led men through hell and back, now found himself facing the quiet battles of old age. His hair had grayed, his back had bent, and a cane replaced the rifle he once carried. But what pained him more than the physical toll of service was the sense of invisibility that crept in with each passing year. In the busy streets of the towns he once fought for, Calvin became just another old man. People saw the walking stick before they saw the man. They saw the wrinkles before they saw the decades of sacrifice etched into his face. The same society that celebrated him on holidays and in parades seemed to look past him on ordinary days. The clerks who called him Grandpa didn't see the warrior who once kept their freedom safe. The kids who chuckled at his slow gait didn't know the price he'd paid, so they could laugh so freely. And this is where the deeper tragedy lies. Calvin Mercer's story is not unique. It is the story of thousands of quiet heroes in modern America, men and women who gave the best years of their lives so that others could live theirs in peace. Veterans who fade into the background of our communities, unseen and unacknowledged until someone reminds us who they really are. Walk into any small town, diner, hardware store, or quiet park, and you'll find them. The man in the corner booth with a faded military cap. The woman who stands a little straighter than most, even with age. The neighbor who waves but rarely speaks of where they've been. These are the silent giants among us. Warriors who deserve more than a quick nod on Veterans Day or a thank you for your service. Recited out of habit, Calvin Mercer didn't need praise. But like all those who served, he deserved respect, and when that respect was denied, as it was that day at the gun store, what happened next wasn't just about him. It was about reminding all of us what loyalty looks like, what sacrifice means, and why some debts, the ones paid in courage, blood, and unwavering honor, can never truly be repaid. The morning sun had barely cleared the rooftops when Calvin Mercer stepped out of his modest apartment. The air carried the weight of late summer, thick, heavy, the kind that clung to your skin and made every breath feel earned. Calvin paused for a moment at the edge of the sidewalk, leaning slightly on his well-worn cane, his navy cap, faded from years of sun and rain, shielded his eyes as he squinted toward Main Street. It wasn't the heat that made him hesitate. It was the weight of the memories that always accompanied these small journeys. Every step toward the gun store felt like a march through time. The tap of his cane against the cracked pavement echoed the cadence of boots from years long gone. As he walked, Calvin's mind wandered, not out of distraction, but because the past was never far behind him. The jungles of Vietnam, the dust of Iraq, the narrow alleys of forgotten battlefields, they lived in his bones as surely as the ache in his hip, a gift from a mission that no one outside his team would ever know about. The gun store sat between a Subway and a tire shop, its storefront plastered with flags, stickers, and bold promises of supporting our troops. Calvin studied it for a long moment before stepping inside. The flags were bright, the stickers crisp, but they felt like decorations rather than devotion. A kind of patriotism for show, the kind you could buy at checkout or slap on a bumper, the kind that cost nothing real. Inside, the air conditioning hit him hard, artificial, cold, the opposite of the warmth the flags outside tried to promise. The store smelled of gun oil, plastic packaging, and polished displays. Rifles and handguns lined the walls like museum pieces, some modern, some replicas of the weapons Calvin had carried in places where the wrong decision meant death. To Calvin, guns weren't toys, weren't collector's items, weren't status symbols. They were tools and sometimes burdens. But here, under the fluorescent lights and sales signs, they were packaged dreams, fantasies for weekend warriors. The culture of guns in America had changed. What once had been about necessity, defense, and duty had become, in many places, about image, about playing at heroism without paying its cost. Behind the counter leaned a man, Tyler, young, barely more than a boy, really, with the casual arrogance of someone who hadn't yet been tested by life. His store polo was a size too tight, as if to showcase arms that had never carried a comrade off the field. Dylan, older, maybe mid-30s, with the beginnings of a paunch and the air of someone who had settled into his small corner of authority, content to judge from behind glass and steel. Calvin approached the counter, his eyes drawn to the M1 Garand. Mounted on the wall, the rifle glowed softly under the store lights, its wood polished to a shine, its barrel pristine. It was the same model he'd carried as a young man, the first real weight he'd shouldered as a soldier. Not just the weight of the metal, but the responsibility, the knowledge that every pull of the trigger changed the world forever. "Excuse me," Calvin said, his voice calm, steady, though the years had added gravel to its tone. "Could I take a look at that Garand?" Tyler glanced up from his phone, his eyes taking in the cane, the cap, the careful way Calvin stood. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, the kind of smirk that spoke of ignorance, of youth untempered by understanding. "That one?" Tyler echoed. Incredulous. "You sure, Grandpa? That thing's heavy. Probably not what you're looking for." Dylan chuckled without looking up from a glossy gun magazine. "Yeah, those old rifles kick like a mule. Might want to stick to something more your speed. Maybe a .22, won't throw your back out." Their words weren't loud, but they hit harder than any bullet. Not because they were cruel, but because they were dismissive. They didn't seek Calvin Mercer. They saw an old man, frail, slow, irrelevant. They saw the cane, the limp, the years, but not the man who had carried that weight, who had earned every scar. Calvin could have corrected them, could have listed the medals, the missions, the friends he'd buried, but what would have been the point? So he did what men like him had always done. He let dignity speak louder than pride. "I understand," Calvin said simply. He tipped his head in polite acknowledgement. "Thank you for your time." The tap of his cane as he turned echoed in the quiet store, louder than it should have been, a slow, steady reminder that some men don't need to shout to command respect. The two clerks didn't watch him leave. Tyler was already back on his phone. Dylan flipped to the next page of his magazine, the moment already forgotten to them. But not to Calvin, and not to the silent witness, a woman near the ammunition shelf who saw everything, who understood what they didn't, who knew that some debts of honor don't just belong to the man, they belong to us all, outside. The store's display of flags fluttered slightly in the breeze. Calvin paused at the door. feeling the sun on his face, feeling the ache in his hip, feeling the familiar loneliness of a warrior in a world that had moved on. The walk back to his truck felt heavier than before, not from age, but from the weight of what had just transpired. And somewhere inside him, Calvin knew this wasn't over. Not today. The gun shop's morning business carried on as if nothing had happened. Tyler returned to scrolling his phone, chuckling at videos that seemed urgent in his small world. Dylan leaned back against the counter, magazine resting on his chest, his mind already drifting to lunch plans and the clock slowly ticking toward the end of another shift. The air conditioning hummed and the flags outside the shop continued to flutter lazily in the breeze. To them, the old man who had shuffled out moments earlier was already forgotten. Just another customer who didn't matter, just another day. But across town, in places where real brotherhood still meant something, a different story was unfolding. Commander Paul Grady was pouring a second cup of black coffee when his phone buzzed. The voice on the other end was quiet, urgent, and familiar. A teammate's daughter who had been at the shop. She spoke few words. She didn't have to say much. Paul understood before she finished. Calvin Mercer had been disrespected, mocked, dismissed like he was nothing. Paul's expression hardened, though his voice stayed steady. Within minutes, the call went out. 12 men, no hesitation, no need for explanation. Because when a brother's dignity is attacked, you don't ask questions, you show up. They came in black SUVs, their arrival unnoticed at first by the store's clerks, too absorbed in their trivialities. The vehicles rolled to a stop with the smooth precision of men who had spent decades learning how to move as one. No horns, no screeching tires, just the quiet efficiency of warriors who knew that real power doesn't announce itself with noise. When the doors opened, the heat of the day seemed to pause. 12 men stepped out, older now, but unmistakable. In bearing, their faces lined, their hair streaked with gray, but their eyes still sharp. Some wore jeans and work boots, others cargo pants and plain shirts, no uniforms. They didn't need them. The way they moved together, the way they held themselves, the way they scanned the surroundings. It said everything. At their head was Commander Paul Grady, broad-shouldered, his stride steady and measured. He was a man whose voice had once guided men through fire and chaos. He didn't shout, he didn't gesture, he simply led, and the others followed. They crossed the parking lot, 12 men in step, without a word. They didn't need to speak. The silence was their strength, the kind of silence that fills a space, that makes the air heavy, that tightens the chest of anyone watching. A silence forged in places where words had no use, where action meant survival. Inside the shop, Dylan glanced out the window and frowned. "Well, would you look at that?" he muttered. "What's this? Some government inspection?" Tyler barely looked up. "Probably. Just some contractors or something. Happens all the time." But as the door chimes sounded, the same cheerful ding that had announced Calvin Mercer's arrival, the atmosphere shifted. The 12 entered, not with aggression, but with undeniable purpose. They fanned out slightly, their presence filling the space. They didn't touch a thing. They didn't look at the merchandise. They looked only at the clerks. Paul stepped forward, resting his hands lightly on the counter, his gaze steady. Tyler tried a nervous laugh, but it died in his throat. Dylan straightened instinctively, though his mouth had gone dry. Paul spoke, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of command. "An old friend of ours came in here this morning. He didn't come looking for trouble. He didn't want special treatment. He just wanted to see a piece of his history. And you laughed at him. You dismissed him." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn photograph. The image showed a younger Calvin Mercer flanked by his team in some forgotten corner of the world. Dirt-streaked, eyes hard but kind, arms slung over shoulders of men who'd follow him anywhere. Paul laid the photo on the counter like evidence at a trial. "This is who you mocked." One by one, the others produced their own tokens, faded pictures, patches, small relics of service, a flag patch burned at the edges, a brass button from a uniform lost to time, a unit coin worn smooth from decades in a pocket. The clerk stared, speechless, because in those small, simple items lay stories too heavy for words. Stories of nights spent under fire, of friends carried out on shoulders, of promises made beside fresh graves. Stories they would never know but could feel now in the presence of these men. Paul's voice softened, but the steel remained. We're not here to threaten you. We're here to remind you of something you forgot. That man, Calvin Mercer, earned every breath of freedom you take. His silence isn't weakness, it's strength. The kind you don't understand until you've needed it. And when you mocked him, you mocked all of us. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Tyler swallowed hard. Dylan opened his mouth, but no words came. What could they say? Apologies seemed hollow, explanations useless, and still, the 12 didn't raise their voices. They didn't demand anything. They simply stood there, letting the truth of their presence speak. A silent wall of loyalty and honor, of debts that could never be repaid, only acknowledged. This was brotherhood, the kind that doesn't fade with age or distance or the end of wars, the kind that shows up quietly when it matters most, the kind that doesn't need speeches or threats, just presence, just solidarity, just that unspoken promise we will always have each other's backs. After long moments, Paul gathered the photographs, the patch, the coin. You don't need to remember us, he said quietly, but remember him and remember what respect looks like. They turned as one, their boots silent on the floor, and as they left, the store felt emptier somehow, as if something sacred had passed through and left the space hollow in its wake. Outside, the 12 climbed back into their vehicles. No fanfare, no boasts, just the quiet satisfaction of having done what was right, because that's what brotherhood demanded. Inside the shop, the clerks stood frozen, the lesson sinking in. That respect isn't owed because of age or appearance. It's owed because some men, like Calvin Mercer, paid a price that others can't even imagine. The room felt heavy, as if the weight of the SEAL's silent presence had pressed the very air out. Of the gun shop, Tyler and Dylan stood behind the counter, faces pale, eyes darting between the men who filled the space before them. The usual bravado was gone, stripped away by something far more powerful than anger or threats. Truth. Commander Paul Grady, calm and steady, reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. He opened it slowly, deliberately, as if handling something sacred. From within, he withdrew a photograph, its edges frayed, its surface creased from years of being carried in a pocket close to the heart. He laid it gently on the glass counter. In the photo, a younger Calvin Mercer stood at the center of a group of men. Their faces were streaked with dirt and sweat, their uniforms torn and dusted with sand. Behind them rose the crumbled walls of a bombed-out building, the sky hazy with smoke. But it wasn't the scene that held attention. It was the way the men stood together, shoulders touching, arms slung over one another like brothers who'd faced death and lived to tell the tale. Calvin, even then, had the same steady gaze, the look of a man who carried responsibility, not as a burden, but as a promise. Paul's voice broke the silence, low but clear. This was Fallujah. We lost that day. Calvin carried one of them out, on his back under fire, half a mile to the medevac. The other, he stayed with him until the end. One by one, the SEALs stepped forward. Each produced an artifact, small, simple, but loaded with meaning. A scorched flag patch, edges blackened, a unit coin smoothed from decades of being rubbed between nervous fingers, a dog tag bent from the impact that ended a young life, and more photographs. Calvin helping to pull civilians from a collapsed building after an earthquake. Calvin teaching a young recruit to clear a room properly, his hands steady on the boy's shoulder. Calvin, arms outstretched, helping a wounded comrade into a helicopter as bullets tore the air around them. The counter became an altar of memory, of sacrifice, of stories never told to strangers until now. Tyler stared down at the images, his hands trembling slightly. Dylan swallowed hard, the earlier smirk gone from his face, replaced by something that looked a lot like shame. Paul let the weight of those moments settle before he spoke again. You saw an old man with a cane. We see the man who kept us alive, the man who showed us what courage looks like when it costs everything. The younger SEALs nodded, their faces solemn. They didn't need to add to Paul's words. The photographs spoke louder than anything they could say because those images, those frozen moments of grit and grace, were proof that Calvin Mercer had lived his life in service to others. Proof that respect wasn't something he demanded. It was something he'd earned 1,000 times over. Tyler's voice, when it finally came, was soft, hesitant. "We didn't know," he whispered, eyes still fixed on a photo of Calvin hoisting a wounded soldier over his shoulder. "We just didn't know." Dylan nodded, his own voice tight. "It's true. We saw the cane, the limp. We didn't look past it." Paul's gaze softened slightly, but his tone stayed firm. "That's the problem. You didn't care to look, and you're not the only ones. Too many people forget that these men walk among us every day. They don't ask for recognition, but they deserve your respect." There was a deep truth in Paul's words, a truth that echoed beyond the walls of that small shop. The artifacts on the counter weren't just mementos. They were living history. Each one held the weight of lives touched, saved, or honored. Each was a thread in the fabric of brotherhood that Calvin had helped weave through decades of service, and that was the heart of it. Memories like these weren't meant to be hidden away in old albums or left to fade in forgotten drawers. They were meant to be shared, not for glory, but to remind us all what sacrifice really looks like. To remind us that courage doesn't always come with a headline or a medal ceremony. Sometimes it walks into a shop quietly on a cane, wearing a faded cap, and if we don't look closely, we miss it. The SEALs began gathering their items, handling each piece with reverence. Paul left one photo behind, Calvin, young and unbowed, standing with his team beneath a torn flag. He placed it in a small stand beside the M1 Garand on the wall. "This stays here," he said, "so maybe the next time a man like Calvin walks through that door, he won't have to remind anyone who he is." Tyler and Dylan nodded, both silent, both changed. The lesson had been delivered, not with raised voices or threats, but with truth, with memory, with the quiet strength of men who understood what loyalty really meant. And as the SEALs turned to leave, the store felt different, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what had just happened, as if the echoes of Calvin Mercer's unseen battles had finally found a place to be honored. The silence after the SEALs departed lingered in the gun shop like a heavy fog. Tyler and Dylan stood motionless behind the counter, staring at the photograph Paul Grady had left. Calvin Mercer, young and resolute, beneath a battered flag, surrounded by brothers who would have followed him anywhere. The air conditioning hummed. The flags outside still fluttered, but something had shifted. The store felt smaller now, as if the weight of what had happened made the walls close in, urging reflection. It didn't take long for action to follow. That very afternoon, Dylan pulled the M1 Garand from its place on the wall, together with Tyler, now silent, thoughtful, and changed. They cleared space in the front of the shop. They found a display case in storage, cleaned its glass until it gleamed, and carefully arranged the photo, the rifle, and a small plaque they had made on the spot, in honor of Chief Calvin Mercer, a warrior among us. But it wasn't just the gun and the photo that filled the case. Tyler added a folded flag, one that had been tucked away in the shop storeroom, forgotten until now. Dylan contributed a brass SEAL team coin a customer had gifted him years earlier, something he had never understood the meaning of until that day. They placed these items with quiet reverence, as if hoping the display might, in some small way, begin to make amends. Word of what had happened spread quickly, faster than either clerk expected. A customer snapped a photo of the new display and posted it online with the caption, "Respect." Finally, the post went viral in the small town's social media circles, and soon beyond. Veterans began stopping by, at first one or two, then in steady numbers. An old Marine from the Korean War came in, stood silently at the case for nearly 10 minutes, and left without a word, his eyes misty. A younger Army sergeant, home from his second deployment, saluted the display before he left the shop. Other businesses took notice. The barber down the street put up a sign, "Veterans. No charge for your first cut. Thank you for your service." The local diner dedicated a corner booth with a small flag, and a sign that simply read, "Reserved for those who served." Even the hardware store started offering discounts for veterans. not because of policy, but because respect had suddenly become contagious, and what started small grew larger. At the next town council meeting, a motion was raised to restore and rededicate the neglected Veterans Memorial in the town square. Funds were pledged, volunteers signed up. What had begun with 12 men standing silently in a gun shop became a wave of acknowledgement that rippled outward, touching lives that had for too long gone unseen. Paul Grady would later say that none of them had planned it that way. They hadn't gathered that morning to change a town or start a movement. They had come for one reason, to stand for a brother. But sometimes standing for one man reminds a community to stand for all. And here lies the deeper truth, the one that Tyler, Dylan, and so many others came to understand. It doesn't take grand gestures or national headlines to honor those who served. Sometimes it takes something as small as a photograph in a display case, a kind word, a willingness to look past the cane and the gray hair and see the warrior who still stands tall. Inside, the display in the gun shop didn't just honor Calvin Mercer. It reminded everyone who saw it that heroes don't stop being heroes when the battles end. And respect, real respect, is shown not with slogans or stickers, but with actions, with humility, with the courage to say, "We see you, we remember, we thank you." The story of Calvin Mercer reminds us that true heroism often walks quietly among us, unnoticed in the rush of daily life, in every community, whether small towns or big cities. There are men and women like Calvin, veterans who have given the best years of their lives, faced dangers most of us will never know, and returned home not asking for applause, but simply hoping to be seen. And yet, too often we fail to see them. We look past the man with the cane, the woman with the quiet eyes, the neighbor who keeps to himself. We forget that behind those gray hairs or lined faces, maybe someone who once stood between danger and our safety. The lesson here is simple but profound. Respect isn't about a uniform or a holiday speech. It's about recognizing the quiet giants who shape the freedoms we enjoy. So, how do we honor them? Really honor them. It starts small. Listen when they speak. Offer your seat, your time, your thanks not out of obligation, but from the heart. Support local veteran programs. Volunteer at AVA Hospital. Donate to organizations that provide real help, not just slogans. And most of all, teach your children that courage doesn't always look like a movie hero. Sometimes it looks like an old man at the corner table, quietly remembering those who didn't make it home. Today, many veterans face challenges we can't see, injuries that linger, memories that haunt, struggles to find purpose in civilian life. They shouldn't have to fight for dignity at home after fighting for our country abroad. That's where we, as a community, come in. So now I turn this story over to you. Who are the quiet heroes in your life? Maybe it's a grandfather who never spoke of his service, a neighbor who always shows up when help is needed, a friend who wears no medals but carries heavy memories. Share their story in the comments below. Let's fill this space with reminders of the heroes who walk beside us. If this story of loyalty and quiet courage moved you, help us spread it. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel where we honor those who serve, not just with words, but with the respect they've earned. Together, we can ensure that no veteran, no quiet hero ever feels invisible again. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next